Put off the train at a water stop with no name. Ruth Calloway stood on the cracked earth platform and watched the lost car of the westbound rattle away into the heat shimmer until it was nothing but a smudge on the horizon, taking with it the conductor who had put her off for one of a $2 fare she no longer had, and every possession she owned save the carpetbag now sitting in the red dust at her feet. She had counted her money 3 times crossing Kansas, certain each time she had miscalculated, certain the sum would come out different if she only added it again. It never did. Somewhere between Independence and this nameless stretch of Colorado scrub, the fare had simply run short, and the conductor, a man with tired eyes and no patience left for hard luck stories, had set her down at the next stop regardless of what lay beyond it. What lay beyond it, as far as Ruth could see in any direction, was nothing. No town, no house, no tree taller than her own shoulder, only flat-baked ground stretching to a horizon gone white with heat, and a warthog standing sentinel over a depot no bigger than a woods, locked up tight with no agent in sight. She began walking, because standing still felt like giving up, and giving up was a thing Ruth Calloway had promised herself, 3 states and 1 dead husband ago, that she would not do again. She had married Harlan Calloway at 19, believing in the life he'd promised her out west. Had buried him 2 years later to a fever that took half the wagon train with him, and had spent the 18 months since scraping together enough for train fare toward a cousin in California who might, if her letters had ever actually reached him, take her in. She had learned, in the 18 months since Harlan died, to measure her life in exactly this fashion, 1 mile at a time, one problem solved before the next could be considered, because looking too far down any road only showed her how much farther she still had to go alone. She had sewn for other women's households in 3 different towns, had slept in church basements and once, for a bad stretch in Nebraska, in the back of a livery stable, and had told herself each time that this hardship too was only temporary. Only a single mile and in a longer walk toward a life she still believed for her somewhere ahead. The sun climbed high and merciless. By the time she'd walked what she guessed to be 3 miles, her water was gone, her feet were blistered inside boots gone thin at the sole, and the flat scrub had begun to swim at the edges of her vision in a way that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She heard the horse before she saw it, hooves drumming steady across the hard pan, and turned to find a rider bearing down on her at a pace that suggested he'd spotted her from some distance and hadn't liked what he saw. "Ma'am." He reined up hard enough that dust rose around the horse's legs and swung down before the animal had fully stopped, a tall man, sundark, with the kind of steady grey eyes that took stock of a situation fast and without wasted motion. "You're a far piece from anywhere out here. You hurt?" "Put off the train," Ruth managed, her voice cracking with thirst. "I ran short of fare." He looked at her a long moment, the blistered feet, the empty canteen at her hip that she'd stopped carrying water in miles back, because there was nothing left to carry, and something in his weathered face tightened with a quiet anger that wasn't aimed at her. Man ought to be horsewhipped, setting a woman down alone in country like this. He was already unhooking his own canteen, pressing it into her hands with an insistence that left no room for pride to refuse it. "Drink slow. Name's Quaid Merrick. I've got a place 4 miles on. You'll not make it walking, not in this heat, not in those boots." Ruth drank, and the water was the sweetest thing she had tasted in her life, and when she looked up at him over the canteen's rim she found herself, for the first time in 18 months of careful, guarded self-reliance, deciding to trust a stranger simply because the alternative was dying of thirst on principle. "I've nothing to pay you for the trouble," she said. "I ought to tell you that plain, before you go to any more." "Didn't ask you for payment." He was already swinging back up into the saddle, reaching a hand down to help her up behind him with the easy, practical courtesy of a man used to solving problems rather than discussing them. "Ask me again once we're out of this sun." The ranch, when they reached it, was a low, sturdy house set back from a well-kept yard, more prosperous than Ruth had expected from the plain way Quaid Merrick had described it, with good fences and a barn in solid repair. A grey-haired woman came out onto the porch at the sound of hooves, took one look at Ruth's state, and had her inside and settled with cool water and a damp cloth before Quaid had finished seeing to the horse. "Mrs. Hobbs keeps my house since my mother passed," Quaid explained later, Once Ruth had bathed and rested and found herself, self-consciously, in a borrowed dress at his kitchen table, too grateful and too exhausted to argue about propriety. "She'll see you're looked after proper till we figure what's to be done." "What's to be done?" Ruth repeated and heard the flatness in her own voice, the particular weariness of a woman who had run out, for the moment, of plans. "I don't rightly know myself, Mr. Merrick. I was meant for California. A cousin there. I don't even know if my letters reached him before I left. No money for the rest of the fare? None. I spent the last of it on the ticket that got me this far." He was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table, and when he spoke again there was a careful, deliberate weight to the words, as though he'd thought them through before saying them aloud. "I could wire you the fare on to California, if that's truly what you want. Wouldn't be a burden. But I'll say plain, Mrs. Calloway, that I've got a big empty house and more work here than Mrs. Hobbs, and I can rightly manage between us, and I'd sooner offer you honest wages and a roof than send you off walking toward a cousin who might not even remember writing you back." Ruth studied him across the table, the plain, steady offer, no calculation in it that she could find, only the same unhurried practicality he'd shown finding her half-collapsed on the Colorado flats. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because I found you 3 miles from anywhere with your boots falling apart and not a soul in the world looking out for you," he said simply. "Man doesn't need a better reason than that." She stayed. There seemed, in the end, no sensible argument against it, not with her feet still blistered and her funds at nothing, and a cousin whose silence had already told her most of what she needed to know about her welcome in California. She took up work alongside Mrs. Hobbs, mending and cooking and tending the kitchen garden, and found in the weeks that followed that the ranch's steady rhythms were the first thing in 18 months that had felt less like surviving and more like living. Quade Merrick, she learned slowly, in the way a person learns a landscape by walking it rather than reading a map of it, was a man who said little and meant every word of what he did say. He had built the ranch up himself from a hard, lean start, had buried a mother and, before that, watched a father drink away a first attempt at the same land, and carried the particular quiet of a man who had learned early that steadiness was worth more than promises. "You don't talk much about yourself," she told him one evening, the two of them shelling peas on the porch while the sky went copper over the flats. "Not much worth telling. I work the land, I keep my word, and I don't much care for men who don't do either." He glanced at her, something almost shy in it despite his size and his sun-worn hands. "I like hearing you talk, though. About Harlan, about the wagon train, about any place you've been that I haven't. Feels like the house has been quiet a long while, and forgot how to hold a voice in it till you came." Ruth felt something in her chest loosen at that, a knot she had carried so long she'd nearly forgotten it as a knot rather than simply the shape of her own ribs. "I didn't think I'd want to talk about Harlan again, not to anyone, but it doesn't hurt the way I expected, telling you. Grief eases when it's shared out. Carrying it alone just makes the weight worse than it has to be." She rode with him into Stagecoach Gap the following Saturday, the first time she'd shown her face in the small town since arriving, and felt the weight of curious stares from women at the Mercantile, who plainly knew every detail of how she'd come to be living under Quade Merrick's roof, chaperone or no chaperone. One woman, sharp-faced under a straw bonnet, asked pointedly whether Mrs. Calloway meant to stay on much longer, and what her people back east would think of the arrangement. "My people back east are gone, ma'am," Ruth answered, steady despite the flush climbing her neck, "same as Mr. Merrick's are gone. I expect we're neither of us obliged to explain a decent, honest arrangement to anyone who hasn't troubled to ask what it actually is before judging it." Quade, waiting by the wagon, said nothing to the women at all, only handed Ruth up onto the seat with a courtesy so plain and unhurried that it silenced the gossip more effectively than any argument could have, and as they rode back toward the ranch in the long gold light of afternoon, he glanced sideways at her with something like pride warming his usually guarded face. "You didn't have to defend yourself to them." "I wasn't defending myself," Ruth said. "I was defending you. It didn't seem right, letting them talk about your kindness as though it were something shameful." He was quiet a long moment, the wagon wheels creaking steady beneath them. "Nobody's stood up for me like that in longer than I care to say. Trouble came in October, when an early blizzard rolled down off the mountains faster than the almanac or the old-timers had predicted, catching half the herd out on the North Range with Quaid and his one remaining hand when the first white wall of it hit. Ruth watched from the kitchen window as the world outside went from clear autumn afternoon to blinding whiteout in the space of 20 minutes, and felt a cold dread settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. Night fell and the men did not come back. Mrs. Hobbs kept the lamps burning in every window facing north. A signal fire lit in the yard, despite the wind that threatened to scatter it, and Ruth paced the length of the porch until her borrowed boots wore a track in the fresh snow. Straining for any sound beneath the storm's roar that might be hoofbeats rather than wind. "He's crossed worse than this," Mrs. Hobbs said, more to fill the silence than because either of them believed it fully, ladling coffee that had long since gone cold into cups neither woman drank from. "Man knows this land better than his own hands. Land doesn't care how well a man knows it, not in weather like this." Ruth pressed her face to the frost-rimed window, straining to see past the swirling white to anything at all. She thought of Harlan, of how quickly a fever had taken him despite every remedy she'd tried, of how little warning the world troubled to give before it took something precious away, and found she could not bear the thought of losing another man she loved to a danger she was powerless to stand between him and. She had told herself after Harlan that she would never again let herself care so much that a stranger's safe return could undo her so completely. Standing at that frozen window, she understood how thoroughly that promise had already failed her. It was near midnight when she heard it, a horse stumbling, and a man's voice calling hoarse and half-frozen through the dark. She was off the porch and into the blinding white before Mrs. Hobbs could stop her, following the sound with her shawl pulled tight and her heart hammering, until she found Quaid on foot, leading his exhausted horse with the last of the stray cattle bunched ahead of him, his coat rimed with ice and his hands, when she reached him, so cold he could barely close them around hers. "Thought I told you to stay inside where it's warm," he managed, teeth chattering, and she could have wept with relief and fury both at finding him alive enough to make a joke of it. "And I thought I told you a person doesn't have to face a storm alone if there's someone waiting who loves them enough to come looking." She shot back, getting his arm over her shoulders and turning them both toward the house's lit windows. "So it seems we're both in the habit of ignoring good sense." He went still for half a step, even in the biting wind at the word loves, and looked down at her with an expression she couldn't read in the dark and the snow, but felt anyway, warm as a hearth fire promised at the end of a long, cold road. They got him inside, got him warmed and dried and fed, and it was near dawn before the color came fully back into his face and the shivering eased enough for him to speak plain. Ruth sat beside the bed Mrs. Hobbs had insisted on, too wounded with worry to consider her own exhaustion, and it was Quaid who finally broke the quiet. "You said a word out there in the snow," he said. "I don't know if you meant it plain, or if it was just the fright talking." "I meant it," Ruth said, and found she was not afraid to say so a second time, warm firelight steady on both their faces where cold and storm had been only hours before. "I came to this country with nothing, Quaid Merrick, put off a train in the middle of nowhere with my last hope in California and my feet bleeding through my boots. You didn't have to stop for me. You didn't have to offer me a place or a wage or your quiet evenings on this porch. But you did, every time, without once making me feel like a burden for needing it. I love you. I've known it a while now and been too proud and too scared to say it plain." He reached for her hand, his own still cold from the storm but steady, and held it like something he did not intend to let go of again. "Then marry me, Ruth Calloway. Not out of gratitude, and not because you've nowhere else to go. Marry me because I've been alone in this house a long while and never once minded it, until you filled it up with your voice, and I understood what quiet had really been costing me." Outside, the storm was breaking into a clean, bright dawn. Snow lying deep and pure over the flats that had so nearly cost him his life, and Ruth, looking at the man who had found her walking half-lost through open country and never once let her walk alone again since, says before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and meant every word of it down to the bone. Mrs. Hobbs wept openly when they told her over breakfast, declaring she'd known it was coming since the very first week, and rode into Stagecoach Gap herself that same afternoon to spread the news before the sharp-tongued women at the Mercantile could spread anything unkind instead. Ruth stood on the porch that evening, watching the last of the storm's clouds break apart into streaks of gold over land that had once seemed to her only a stretch of empty, dangerous nothing between one lost life and the next. It did not feel empty any longer. It felt, for the first time since she had buried Harlan on the trail west, entirely and completely like home, and when Quaid came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing, she understood that home had never truly been a place at all. It had been waiting for her the whole time, patient as the prairie itself, in the shape of a quiet man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was.